Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great honor, in fact, to be in this very august building. Curious footnote to the David Beckham story. The Beckhams may have a 4-foot-high golden Buddha in their living room. There's a temple in Thailand that has a golden statue of David Beckham in a temple. Now, what that is saying about the West or the East or neither or both, understanding or misunderstanding Buddhism, I don't know, but it's a reality. I'd like to open with a very short story concerning a 9th century Chinese Zen monk called Yunmen. And he was once asked, what is the teaching of the Buddha? And his answer was, an appropriate statement. Now, I've thought a lot about that, and I think it touches on something very crucial. One of the things it touches on is the fact that we do need to differentiate between Buddhism, remembering that Buddhism, this word, is a recent Western invention. It was first used at the early 19th century. There's no equivalent term. There's no ism-like term in any Asian language. And on the other hand, what Buddhists call Buddhism, which is the Dharma, or the Dhamma, which doesn't really translate. Law, principle, something like that, teaching. So when Yunmen is asked, what is the highest teaching of the Buddha? He says an appropriate statement. For him, the Dhamma is not reducible to a dogma. It's not reducible to some doctrinal definition. This is very much at the heart of the whole Zen movement. It broke with the idea that somehow Buddhism could be defined, fitted into neat categories, philosophies, metaphysics, ethical systems. All of that is part of Buddhism, but the Dhamma, which underpins it, from which it originates, which is in a way its living force, that cannot be so reductively identified. I was recently reading Alistair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue, where he speaks of how a living tradition is one that is in a constant, ongoing conversation with its past. And I feel in my own case, I'm not a Buddhist academic. I have no credentials in terms of academic degrees or anything like that. I consider myself someone who is trying to practice the Dhamma, in other words, trying to appropriately embody some of these values and concepts and ideas and texts and meditations and so on in such a way that hopefully I might be able to make an appropriate statement in terms of the situation we find ourselves in today, both personally, socially, culturally. If Buddhism, don't like that word, is going to make a living response to the world of our times, it needs to be able to speak with an authentic voice, not merely reciting or repeating classical teachings or beliefs or doctrines from a particular school. Now, one of the things that probably many of you will have noticed, even on a rather cursory notion of what Buddhism is that it has an enormous diversity. You have Zen Buddhist monks in Japan, you have the Dalai Lama in Tibet, you have yellow-robed, tranquil monks walking through Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, and so on. Nowadays also you have Japanese groups who vigorously chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo for all kinds of purposes. It's quite baffling in a way to be able to understand, well, what is it that holds all these different groups of people together? What is the unifying principle? What is in common to these things? I'm not sure there is, in fact, a definition that you can provide that would answer that question. One of the things I think this shows is the richness of the tradition that has, over its 2,500-year history, found itself in very different conditions other than that of India of the time of the Buddha, in China, Central Asia, South Asia, and on each occasion, and this process is usually taken maybe 200 or 300 years, this process of acculturation, and the Dharma, in reaction and response to the needs of these specific historical places and times, has come up with another form, which we now call Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, etc. That's what I'm going to call Buddhism. Now, I think it's quite easy to understand the doctrines and the teachings of those particular schools. And many of them, I think, have developed some of the earlier ideas in very, very revealing ways. But I also feel that in this same process, there has sometimes been a tendency to obscure some of the things the historical Buddhists said. One of the differences that I think modernity brings to the evolution of the Dharma, is that inescapably we see something like Buddhism as an historically contingent phenomenon. We think of Japanese Buddhism and we would fairly automatically say, well, this is what happens to the teachings of the Buddha when they went to 14th century Japan. This is the emergent result of that encounter. Now, what has happened in all religions, is that over time these institutional forms, these doctrinal beliefs, very easily become rather rigid, become rather non-negotiable. So in Buddhism too, we have heretics, we have the faithful, all of the things that you would expect to find in, say, Christianity. If I think of Buddhism as a living tradition, however, whatever I might find of value in any of these schools will, I think, only ever be a partial response to the question of my own life now, our own lives in modernity today. So in other words, Buddhism in modernity is confronted with an historical awareness of itself. Buddhism is contingent. Now, this shouldn't be surprising, given some of the basic ideas that have always informed the Buddhist, and I'll just name three: impermanent, dukkha, unsatisfactory, imperfect, was Don Cupid has recently called it bitter, bittersweet, and contingent, empty, not existing in and of itself in its own right. And I think what I found very helpful is to start to think of Buddhism in terms of the core ideas that the Buddha himself taught. Buddhism too is impermanent. Buddhism is imperfect. Buddhism is contingent, empty. There is no essential Dharma or teaching. That we're talking about something that is living, like an organism in a sense, that is constantly in process and in flux. It's constantly interacting with new environments and situations. It's constantly being asked questions for which tradition may not have a ready-made answer at all. So as a practice, I feel that what I'm trying to do is to give voice to a sense of Buddhism, of the Dharma, but in a way that speaks to our condition here today. And this is risky. I might be getting it wrong, but I feel for my own practice to be authentic, If I don't do that, I'm somehow copping out. Thank you.
Okay, well, much of what I have to say won't be a repetition of what Stephen has said, but in some senses, I hope, adding to it. Let's start off with a very fundamental thing, how the West has misunderstood Buddhism. Well, here's a couple of quotes to give you the way that the West has misunderstood Buddhism. In 1889, somebody called Monia Williams, who was a great Sanskrit scholar, he was a High Court judge as well, wrote this: "Which book shall we clasp to our hearts in our last hour? The book that tells us of the dead, the extinct, the death-giving Buddha, or the book that reveals to us the living, the eternal, the life-giving Christ?" He also says, just a few paragraphs later, this is the most unmitigated system of pessimism the world has ever seen. I think that says it all, really. This is how the West has misunderstood Buddhism in its early times. And one of the things that we must never forget, and I think Stephen pointed this out in the contingency, is when Buddhism started to be adopted and studied in the Western world, they got an awful lot wrong, partly because they were seeing through the world view of Christianity. Now, one can't fault the early translators and the early scholars because they came from Christian backgrounds. There's no doubt about that. But unfortunately, what we've got into a system of now is repeating all of their mistakes. And their mistakes are often to do, and I'm not going to go into details about this because it would take me into a long kind of digression, a lot of the mistakes are in translation. In the actual translation of Pali and Sanskrit terms, the basic lexicon of all of Buddhist terminology. This leads us into a position of thinking of Buddhism as very much a religion. We talk about monks, we talk about monasteries, we talk about enlightenment. That's a wonderful word. We talk about meditation. There are many, many other words I could refer to. There's this untranslatable word that Stephen referred to, dukkha. Totally untranslatable, but everybody keeps repeating it as suffering. Unfortunately, of course, this is what Monia Williams is referring to when he talks about it as being the most unmitigated pessimism. Because there is suffering, and then there is extinction, as far as he's concerned. Nothing else. So Buddhists aim at extinction from this early 19th century point of view, the point of view of Monia Williams. So we keep on repeating the same problems that the early translators gave us. And unfortunately, and this is one of my big criticisms of a lot of popular works on Buddhism, and continues to repeat this misunderstanding, is we literally keep on repeating the same terms again and again and again, without any attempt to rethink what's actually going on. Now, part of my work, and some of the work I've been, and I gather Stephen's doing exactly the same, is going back to the original texts and seeing what happens when you look at the original text and what is there within the original text if you look at them with the unjaundiced eye by pushing or bracketing out at least the traditions that we have. Now, this has led me into, at one stage, quite recently actually, in being called a Buddhist fundamentalist. As I go back to the early texts, and most of my ordinary Dharma teaching and my own practice is driven by this, going back to the early texts and seeing what is going on, because not only, I think this is what Stephen was alluding to, not only has the West misunderstood Buddhism, but in a way, the further and further we get in this historically contingent tradition away from the time of the Buddha, the more and more misunderstandings creep in. And so Buddhism, actually, this peculiar word Buddhism, also is a misunderstanding often of what the Buddha is saying in these early texts. So it's a very interesting phenomenon when we start to look at these early texts. Well, the one thing we find, I think, is a Buddha perhaps, and I again, I'll admit to this, might be getting it wrong, we see a Buddha perhaps who's much closer to the 21st century mind, and for very good reasons, which I'll point out in a second. The second is, I didn't mind the accusation of being called a Buddhist fundamentalist, because interestingly, in Buddhism, the more you go back to the ordinary text, the early text, the further you get away from religion. Yeah, this is what happens when you look, because the Buddha, this again is my own personal view of looking at these texts, was not interested in founding anything that in any way could be understood as a religion. In many senses, he is, and I think Stephen alluded to this, is anti-absolutism of any forms. So, for example, one of the chief aspects that tends to get forgotten in the practice of Buddhism in the West is its ethics. And what we have in Buddhist ethics is a non-absolutist ethics. It's a non-prescriptive ethics. It's an ethics which actually is very close to something McIntyre, who you referred to in Stephen's introduction, refers to as virtue ethics. This is what we find in Buddhism, which is much, much closer to Aristotle and is totally anti-prescriptions. So we move away from absolutisms. We move into a much more, how should I say, engaged aspect of life. And this seems to me what the Buddha was trying to say, and how we've misunderstood it. If we misunderstand the Dharma as doctrine, is we get into understanding it simply as a set of rules and prescriptions and belief systems. Now it seems to me, and again I'm going to be slightly controversial about this, that one of the things that's often cited by many Buddhists in the West is something which the Buddha says in the Kalama Sutta and also in another text which I can never find a reference to, which the Tibetans in particular cite, which is saying that everything should be questioned. Everything should be examined. Nothing should be taken on authority. Nothing should be taken on belief. And it seems to me what happens with that, there is a lot of lip service paid to that. And not a lot of actual investigation, not a lot of actual inquiry into deeply, deeply held belief systems. And so I think what we end up with in the West, more often than not, is another religion, particularly as I said, all of the early translations give us the picture of a religious system. And this gets repeated in terms of something that looks much, much more like a traditional religion with belief systems firmly in place rather than the challenging of forms of absolutism and belief, which I think is far more in line with the Western world, particularly in the 21st century. So I think the Buddha's actual stance from looking at the early texts is an anti-religious stance. He's intensely engaged with his own culture. He's intensely critical of his own culture. He utilizes everything within it in some way to undermine it, to undermine the traditionally held belief systems that were going on at his own time. It seems to me if we're in the position of keep on repeating religious traditions, we're actually not engaged fundamentally with something the Buddha set us out, which is far more of a strategy than a set of dogmas. He gives us a strategy for inquiring into every facet of life. Meditation, I mean, it's a very interesting word, which seems to be one of the things which particularly is associated with Buddhism in the West. The thing I usually surprise a lot of people with, particularly actually when I'm teaching Dharma courses, is there is no such word for meditation in the lexicon of Buddhism. Buddhists do not meditate. They cultivate, they grow things. There's a wonderful set of horticultural metaphors that are used. They're engaged in actually bringing something into being. They're not engaged in something which I think is very much more within the tradition of Christianity of taking scripture, contemplating it, and using it as something edifying to reflect on. Now that might go on in certain dimensions of Buddhism, but it's certainly, again, when we start to look at the early text, is not what is happening in the early text. So even the word meditation, which seems to be very, very much almost a prerogative of Buddhism in the sense that it seems to encompass everything, so much so that Buddhism can be reduced in many occasions in the Western world to simply a system of meditation. Vipassana practices, Zen practices, tantric practices. So actually your Buddhism is your style of your meditation, not actually the full correct engagement, which traditionally, again, looking back at the early texts, is a threefold strategy of engagement with dimensions of life, such as your moral, ethical basis for being in the world, your study, your contemplation, your reflection on, and your investigation, deep investigation of the teachings themselves, not in this dogmatic authoritarian way, but something that is worth inquiring into. And finally, of course, this system of actually beginning to cultivate in your own experience something you find worthwhile coming out of the other two strategies. And so Buddhism itself, when it's reduced, and I think this is one of the big misunderstandings of Buddhism in the West, when it's reduced simply to a set of dogmas, a set of practices, it loses something which is essentially there in the early texts. And so I'm quite happy to be a Buddhist fundamentalist if it means going back to those early texts and rediscovering actually something which is very, very exciting and non-dogmatic. Thank you.
There are many, many different aspects of this. Sorry if you can't hear me. There are many different aspects of this which I could pick up on. One of our earlier speakers was Karen Armstrong, and in her book, The Case for God, she has a some very interesting paragraphs where she talks about the etymology of dogma and doctrine. And so everything that you're saying, for example, John, about dogma and doctrine, there are Christians who would say the same thing, that the terms have been corrupted, that we no longer understand really what doctrine really means, and perhaps Giles at some point could raise that as an issue. But right now what I want to pick up on is in fact Alistair MacIntyre's quote that Stephen very helpfully brought into the conversation, which is a living tradition is in constant ongoing conversation with its past. And I suspect many people of very, very different religious persuasions, or philosophical persuasions indeed, would absolutely agree with that. What both of you seem to be doing is ripping up 2,000 years of that tradition to say, I don't want the last 2,500 years, I only want the Buddha. So that's a curious interpretation of MacIntyre's statement.
Well, that's not quite how I would see what I'm doing, frankly. I am, as with John, particularly intrigued, fascinated, and moved by these early Pali texts. But I'm also aware that my interest in them is also framed by my training as a Tibetan Buddhist monk in dialectics and philosophy, without which I wouldn't have many of the basic conceptual tools to do that kind of inquiry. I think what going back to sources is helping me to do is to be able to differentiate what developments within later Buddhism somehow are positive amplifications of those earlier principles, and what aspects in Buddhism are often a slippage back into the kind of dogmatism, religiosity that John mentioned. So I see my engagement with these early texts as a conversation with the past, but informed by my own, rather long-standing engagement with, say Zen. See, I started with Zen. That's not early text. But I think Zen captures something about the living breath of the Dharma that other traditions don't seem to do it quite so well. And likewise, I'm also reading these early texts with the eyes of a 21st century, a post-Christian in my case, secular, critical, historically aware fashion. So I see the value of going back to the early texts as a process of uncovering foundations. And to that extent, I might be a fundamentalist, but I'm not a fundamentalist in the sense that I want to get rid of 2,000 years of history.
Well, you see, the use of fundamentalism as a term makes me very nervous, because when I first heard you sort of talking this way, John, fundamentalist was exactly the term that came into my mind. And fundamentalism is causing havoc in all kinds of religious traditions, and has actually become, very, very destructive in lots of ways that we're familiar with. So how can you be happy being a fundamentalist?
I can be happy with it, because I think, coming back to what you were asking Stephen as well, I think it's part of an ongoing conversation. When we look at the early texts, it's not in isolation. It's not isolation from the history of Buddhism. It's in engagement. So, for example, you can take very important issues that you find in the Buddhist tradition, such as the issue of karma, for example, which some traditions have very strong opinions, very strong dogmas about. Now, looking back at the early texts helps you to engage in, I think, a corrective conversation with what comes later. Now, this is not to dismiss what comes later. It's actually to say, well, sometimes when you look back at the early texts, there is actually a very fundamental difference between what has happened. Now, there's a socio-historical reason, I think Stephen referred to this in his little talk, there's a socio-historical reason for why these things have happened and why these interpretations have occurred in the way that they have in the history of Buddhism. In the early tradition, it was partly because of slippage back into the religiosity of the Buddha's time. You know, he was a radical, a lot of his followers were not as radical as he was. However, I don't think we can dismiss the conversation. We need to engage, even if we're doing work on early texts, even trying to approach our teaching from away from that perspective, we need to engage with that history of Buddhism. Because there's going to be a lot of people sitting out there in your constituency who are actually engaged in those forms. Now, this is another way of looking at it. This is a corrective way of looking at it. I don't say it's the true way, that's going against the absolutism. But it offers very interesting perspectives when you start to engage in that work.
Maybe I could just add and then one other thing in my studies, and I'm sure in John's as well, of these early texts, is that by going back to these early sources, we can begin to get a clearer picture of the kind of world in which the Buddha lived, particularly the world of ideas, of beliefs, of spiritual practices and so on. And we can begin to see that much of what's even in the earliest texts is actually simply put an articulation of a commonly held worldview of 5th century BC India. So I would argue that, for example, all of the stuff about karma, rebirth, this is really just how people more or less generally saw the world at that time. So this analysis is one in which we're also teasing apart what is just Indian thinking or thought 5th century BC, albeit in the Buddha's mouth, and what is the Buddha saying that is actually not derivative from that understanding of the world and the person. And there I think we're even able to sharpen further what it is that is so distinctive and why it is that that person's ideas have managed to be a topic for a talk this evening, which is a bit remarkable, really. So it's not just about saying anything in the Pali Canon is the truth and forget the rest. Not at all.
So is it a process rather similar to what happened in the 19th century in the sort of study for the historical Christ?
Yeah.
Yes.
A lot of that, I think one of the things I think Buddhism, we have to notice that Buddhism is in some respects way behind developments in, say, Christian theology. Yes. That starting from, say, Schleiermacher and then the other theologians through the 19th century, right up to today, we have a very intelligent, critical response to modernity, a self-critical awareness of one's own tradition. Buddhism basically lived until, let's say, the middle of the 20th century in effectively pre-modern, even medieval worlds. And it has suddenly become catapulted into modernity. There's no transition. And I think this has given rise to a huge amount of confusion. It's very difficult if, let's say, you're a young Tibetan monk coming from India, maybe very learned in your tradition, but with no exposure to really much of what others in the wider world would be concerned with. So Buddhism, in a sense, has a lot of catching up to do. And I've, in my own writings from the very earliest times, I've been very influenced by the work of particularly Protestant theology. And I found the tools that have been used can be applied very effectively into the analysis of the sort of text that we're talking about.
I think up until the present moment, there's been very, very little, certainly within Buddhist traditions, of the socio-historical positioning of the Buddha whatsoever. I mean, it's almost, and I used to get this years ago looking at popular books on Buddhism, almost as if Buddhism arose out of a vacuum. There it was, it suddenly appeared. Now the Buddha was in, as I said in the talk, was in a total response to his society. And I think that beginning to position the Buddha in his own time, a la the way you were talking about, the Christian tradition did it with Christ, I think adds to our understanding, adds to what has actually come about in the centuries of the development. It's a long, long development, a very multicultural development, you know, with Tibetan Buddhism being right at the tail, really, of the development of this, with all those other traditions developing in between. A lot of them have lost that sense of that socio-historical rooting. And I would just say, so much so, that sometimes you find the jokes which are placed in the Pali Canon being taken literally. And there's a very classic example of this. There's a sutta in the Pali Canon, which is a sutta where the Buddha is making fun of a Hindu scripture about creation. A lot of traditions will take this literally, yeah, that this is how creation came about. It's the joke that he's making. And I think unless we begin to do that socio-historical work on the original canon, placing it very much within his own context, we lose something, I think, as 21st century thinking Westerners who are taking on board a tradition which is in a sense an alien import into Western culture, and also simply adopting ideas which are being driven by cultures which, because of their far remove often from that early beginnings of Buddhism, have lost touch with the actual context because they never actually knew it in the first place. Okay. Well, again, it's very interesting. Shall I stand up?
Yes, stand up.
It's very interesting when you look at Buddhist ethics, because Buddhist ethics appears, certainly if you look at, say, the ethics for lay people, it appears to have something which is prescriptive. Yet, without going into the details, every part of it, and I'll just give you one, I undertake a rule of training to refrain from harming living beings. That's the first ethical stance of that. Now, rather than a thou shalt or thou shalt not here, or thou shalt not in this case, what we have is something which is a tool for investigating situations of harm that the individual can find themselves in. Now, obviously implies don't kill, and I see it so often listed just simply as don't kill, as an ethical statement. I think that loses something of the force of what the Buddha is trying to do, and when I think about virtue ethics, particularly in the Aristotelian sense, not so much in MacIntyre's sense, but in the Aristotelian sense, I think it's an inquiry into the good. What makes us good? How does that differing sense of good arise in independent situations, differing situations? So when I say it's non-prescriptive, there is no one rule apart from, I think, a default option that you might take, which is if you can't see your way clear to investigating this, then you simply fall back onto a position of non-harm. I think what the Buddha is trying to get you to do in the way he states the ethical position is investigate every individual situation you find yourself in, because that is going to be different, even if prima facie it appears to be the same. So I think the ethical seeming prescriptions in Buddhism are not. They're what I generally refer to as kind of can openers to help you to open up your ethical life.
Very well. Thank you. I'm supposed to take a risk and say in 25 words or less what Buddhism is. That, of course, is a very arrogant presumption on one level. But what I have concluded tentatively in recent years is to identify 4 points that the Buddha taught that cannot be derived from the socio-historical context of his time. In other words, that are distinctively and I think fairly non-controversially his own ideas. The first of these is the principle of contingency, or conditioned arising, or dependent origination. One of the most authoritative accounts of the Buddha's awakening is his awakening to paticca samuppada, the processual, contingent, fluid, unfolding, interconnected nature of life. second principle is the practice of what are called 4 ennobling truths, which I prefer to see as injunctions rather than descriptions. In other words, to fully embrace the suffering of oneself and the world, to let go of grasping and craving, which so often, in a sense, prevent us from that honest embrace of reality, and reduce everything to my own personal desires and fears. Thirdly, to actually try to find a space within one's own experience whereby one is no longer prompted or driven by fear, attachment, hatred, jealousy, pride. And fourthly, of the 4 noble truths, to embark on a way of life, or as John referred to also, to bring into being a way in which your humanity can flourish in all of its aspects, from the way we see things, think about them, speak, act, work, apply ourselves, pay attention, and focus our minds. The third point that I think is distinctive is the Buddha's emphasis on the cultivation of mindfulness, mindful awareness, regarding the specificity of experience. Again, we often find in some later forms of Buddhism that meditation, well, let's use this word meditation, is basically introspective. It's about looking into the very core of your own mind or whatever. Whereas the practice of mindfulness, which I think is the Buddhist meditation par excellence, is actually going in the opposite direction. You start by paying attention to your breath, to your body, your feelings, your mental states, your responses, and then literally whatever is going on in the totality of what's happening right now. That's the aim of this kind of meditation. It is to be fully present to what is taking place right now. And the fourth point I would regard as distinctive is the Buddha's emphasis on self-reliance, on becoming autonomous. The Buddha, again, is a phrase you find in the early text quite a lot. The person who has entered into the path has become independent of others in the Buddha's teaching. And yet today, so often we find this emphasis on finding a teacher, becoming devoted to the teacher, somehow almost surrendering your autonomy in order to, as in the Tibetan schools would say, to receive the blessings of the Lama or the Guru, which to me is totally alien to the originality of what the Buddha first presented. So 1, contingency; 2, 4 noble truths; 3, mindfulness; 4, autonomy, self-reliance. That, in a nutshell, is how I'd understand it.
Are you a Buddha?
Me? It's a loaded question, it's a trick question.
Yes.
Let's say that I aspire to live my life from a perspective that would be an imitatio Buddha. Imitation of Christ, imitation of Buddha. I try to, for me the Buddha is not just a goal that I might arrive at some point in some future. It's a possibility that is open in all of us right now. In every situation we are free either to be Buddha-like in our response or to be Mara, demonic-like in our response.
John, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think, although I agree with Stephen, it's a trick question. In many senses, I think we think of Buddha as being a finality, and it isn't. It's something which is moments of awakening. Now, the word Buddha is actually derived from the word Bodhi, which means to be awakened. So any moments of clarity, insight, awakening that you have, in a sense, in that moment you are a Buddha. But it doesn't mean that you're fixed, because again, it's contingent. It's arising and passing away, and other situations arise which perhaps don't provoke that response when you're not a Buddha at that moment. So I don't think of it as a finality, and I think this can be a big mistake. Interestingly, in the Pali text, you often find a Buddha going back and meditating. Well, if he's a Buddha, fixed and final forever, I can't quite understand that. There's something peculiar about that. I think it's because it's an ongoing process. It's not something which is fixed and final. It's something which I think Stephen very eloquently put and said we aspire to. And in moments of great clarity and insight, perhaps we get there.
What about the other questions?
Sorry, I was just surprised that you didn't ask me if I was. Quite long answers, I'm surprised you didn't ask me. I don't want to talk about this in a very blunt way, it's quite surprising.
The other two questions, John, do you want to comment on the other two questions? One was on contingency and the other one on right to view.
Well, I'll do the contingency one. You can do the right view if you want.
What are you
Can we swap?
Yeah, we can swap if you want. I don't mind. We can swap.
You take which one you want.
Whichever one you want.
Contingency. I'll take contingency. So remind me exactly of the question on contingency.
It was about whether the total experience of interdependence, etc., also includes the consciousness in this moment.
Yes, I mean, basically, when talking about everything being contingent, everything is contingent. Now, consciousness is a very loaded word in Buddhism, particularly in the early texts, and I'm thinking here of the Pali Canon in general, where, for example, it's not one consciousness, it's moments of consciousness which are occurring every second. I'm just using a second here as a kind of indicator. It's occurring every second, and they are differently flavoured. So there is no consciousness which is independent. Consciousness itself is a contingent arising based on the fluctuation of phenomena. So there'll be consciousness associated with thought, consciousness associated with our other five senses and our sense perceptions. And this is a view that Western philosophy came to at the end of the 19th century with Franz Brentano, talking about basically the contingent nature of consciousness, the notion that consciousness always has an object. And so consciousness isn't some kind of background phenomena into which you project the phenomena of existence, but is actually a dependent arising which arises in every moment. So our life is of a world which is also a conscious world, but that consciousness is not one thing. It's changing every moment. It gets into great complexity. In the Pali Canon, it gets into the complexity of saying there is not just one form of consciousness, there's 89 different forms of consciousness, or 121 if you want to take into account meditative states as well. Again, a different way. So consciousness is implicated in the whole notion of contingency. It's not something which is separate from it.
Yeah, and there's a very interesting text in the Pali Canon called the Sabha Sutta, the Discourse on Everything. And the Buddha says, I will teach you everything. And what is everything? It's the eye and what we see, the ear and what we hear, the tongue and what we taste, the nose and what we smell, the body and what we feel, the mind and what we think. That's it. There's nothing outside of that. And all of that is contingent. Consciousness emerges out of the interaction between a visual object and the eye organ. And it's always in process and change. Going on to right view, the notion of right view, when you look at it in the early texts, the Buddha defines it in many, many, many different ways. There's no such thing as the right view. Just a couple that off the top of my head that spring to mind. He sometimes says that understanding the Four Noble Truths is samadhi, right view. At another time he says right view is not to believe in being or non-being, but to experience the world through a middle course. It's more subtle perhaps. It's touching on the idea of shunyata, emptiness. It's what the verse that Nagarjuna uses as the source of his philosophy. And so Micchaditti, a so-called wrong view, In fact, the Tibetan is lokpedawa, which means like back to front view. I don't like the word right, that's wrong too. Yes. The word sama means something, it's translated, it goes right, a very good example of what John said at the very beginning. We're stuck with this word right view. The word sama means something like complete or whole, not right, which gives an inevitable moralistic tone to it, and the opposite thereby we translate as wrong. Miccha I would think of as sort of confused, convoluted, back to front, getting it wrong in that sense. So if we think of, and he never really defines wrong view, he tells you what view, and rather than view I'd rather say vision, perspective, an integral perspective on life, is one that would engage with these four truths, and a life that somehow avoids that confrontation with existence in that way is somehow missing the point, is somehow failing to realize what a human life could be.
Can I just add one thing to that? Because I think I agree with Stephen's translations of this word samma, because samma actually in Pali as well can mean appropriate. It's what is appropriate, and I think this goes into the anti-absolutist stance I was talking about the Buddha having earlier on. It's what's appropriate, and so miccha is inappropriate. What is inappropriate in our understanding, because ditthi can be understanding as well. And so when we're talking about this, we're having to think is what is the appropriate understanding to have at this moment? Now that could be ethical, it could be any number of the issues that the Buddha talks about. But it's moving, it's not static, it's not a doctrine or a dogmatic about what is right and what is wrong. Is it appropriate to this situation or is it inappropriate? Does it lead to the lessening of dukkha or does it give rise to the increase in dukkha in experience?
I'll pick Brian's. There is this debate, culture war between the new atheists and the fundamentalists, believers in one religion or another, and it is totally polarized people. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book I've just published, Confession of a Buddhist Atheist, is to present a Buddhist approach as being, hardly surprisingly, a middle way between these two extremes. It's felt that if you're an atheist, you can't possibly consider yourself to have any religious feelings at all. And if you're a religious person, you obviously have to believe in something like God. Buddhism manages to avoid both of those. It's a tradition that I think taps into the deepest, ultimate questions of human life. What does it mean to be a human being? The Buddha only refused to answer questions that he considered to be of a level of metaphysical abstraction that we could keep on asking until the cows come home and we still wouldn't get the answers. In fact, it's very prescient that the questions the Buddha refused to answer are by and large not answered now. Is the mind and the body the same or different? We call it today the mind-body problem. Does one exist after death or not? Jury's still out, etc. Now what's curious is that it's not only other religions that have taken a great interest in some of these questions, many forms of Buddhism have too. I would suggest that most traditional forms of Buddhism have actually opted for an answer to most of those questions. So I think you can see a very good example here of what starts out as I would consider to be a pragmatic, therapeutic way of life, rapidly shifts into another kind of dogmatic belief system, which I think is what has happened.
Yeah, can I just add something to that? Because I think, again, going back to the early texts is a very interesting phenomenon, because what you get there is the Buddha teaching nothing that isn't practical. The only things he's really interested in is the way people live and how that can influence them. So the kinds of questions, the Avyakata questions, these unanswered questions, is he's just refusing to go there. He's just refusing even to enter into the grounds of debate about any of these questions, simply because they don't deal with the practical issues of life. And I think if we keep that in mind, that that's what's going on in the very earliest strata of Buddhism, I agree with Stephen. Later on, all the traditions try to answer those questions because they become philosophical. You know, when human beings seem to be very philosophical animals, they seem to do it at the drop of a hat. And Buddhism is no exception. It starts to develop a long historical, philosophical tradition. And with different answers coming up in each of the different traditions. So there's no kind of one consensus about this in any particular tradition. Now, what is so interesting about the Buddha's early stance is he refuses to go there at all on those questions and just leaves us with the practical issues of life. And I think that almost feeds quite well into the first question. Because the Buddha really is saying that it's the practical issues of life, it's the contingency, it's the dukkha, the suffering, we're kind of stuck with that unfortunate translation, that every individual has to deal with. There is no utopia. There is no utopia. Again, I think in the later traditions that gets misunderstood. Nirvana becomes like a Buddhist heaven, which it isn't. Just in its ordinary sense, nirvana is a way of being. It's actually a verb form in Pali and Sanskrit, which indicates a way of being in this world. It doesn't indicate a utopian place to which we're going to aspire or get there. So nirvana is replete with dukkha. What has changed is the individual's ability to deal with it. That is what has changed. So there's no sense of absolution in perhaps the way perhaps you're meaning it in a more Christian sense. There's no way of resolving it. The Buddha really is trying to push people back into dealing with their life on a day-to-day unfolding basis, which is a mixture, as often the texts say, of hope, joy, sadness, grief. You know, it's a mixture of these things which come on a day-to-day basis. And actually, the big thing, which hasn't been mentioned at all this evening so far, the big thing that the Buddha really speaks about is not absolution, but equanimity. Having equanimity with the way that life unfolds. Yeah? Neither to cling on to the good stuff that happens, or to be rapidly trying to run away as quickly as possible from the bad stuff that is happening to you. And I think that's what the Buddha gives us. Instead of absolution, he gives us equanimity as a possible goal. Now, I think there's much more nuancing to really understand that, but I think that's a kind of a basic way of trying to approach it.
And what about the question about Buddhism as a therapeutic modality? I mean, I was very struck by Stephen's comment just now that Buddhism is a pragmatic, therapeutic way of life. Yeah. I think you're selling it short.
You do?
Yeah. You think of someone's life like Aung San Suu Kyi.
Aung San Suu Kyi, yeah.
She's, that's not pragmatic, therapeutic way of life.
Well, first of all, I think we have to question what we mean by these terms. Pragmatism, and I would use that in the sense coined by William James and others onward, is really another way of considering what we mean by truth. What is true for a pragmatist is what works, not what somehow corresponds to a state of affairs somehow in reality somewhere. Now, in that sense, I think Aung San Suu Kyi is pragmatic. When I use the word therapeutic, I'm not using it in the sense psychotherapeutic, although that tends to be how we use the word today now. But again, in the more ancient Greek use of really just a cure, a healing of the conflicts and the strife and the bewilderment and the pain that we as human beings experience. Not the fact that I feel anxious because my father did something to me as a child. And we have to remember that another strong parallel, I find, with particularly the early Buddhist text that John's referring to, again with the Greek schools, of the Hellenic schools of Epicurus, the Stoics, even Aristotle too, is the idea that philosophia, a philosophy, the love of wisdom, is of no use at all if it does not cure us of something. The way the word philosophy is used nowadays is largely as a sort of an academic discipline. But for the Greeks, and I think the Buddha too, the Buddha explicitly presented himself as a doctor He saw his teaching as a medication. He saw his community as people who helped you get better. And in that sense, it's therapeutic. But we're dealing with the therapy that is applied to the totality of our existence, our existential angst, our anxiety, our alienation. How do we find a way to somehow resolve or come to terms with the condition of being human? And in that sense, therapeutic.
I mean, that surely is the biggest danger facing Buddhism in the West now, that it gets understood as therapeutic in this very narrow sense of it will help me with, my child abuse, etc. What do you think, John?
Well, I think there's a paradox here, because undoubtedly I agree with Stephen here that Buddhism is therapeutic. I often make the point to students of mine that the Buddha is the first psychologist. If you actually look at what's going on in the world at the same time as the Buddha, even what the Greeks are doing, it's completely different from what the Buddha is doing. And if you look at the Indian context, it's even more different about what's going on. They're engaged in those big metaphysical questions, actually, what that was asked about earlier on. However, to reduce Buddhism merely to a therapy, in the Western sense of the word therapy, I think is a big mistake. That it can have therapeutic usage, I think, is undoubtedly the case. I'm involved in this myself in Oxford, in the use of what's called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is actually the use of mindfulness, which you heard Stephen talk about earlier on, in roles of particularly mental health problems and specifically in depression here. So it undoubtedly has its usages here. Now, I think what tends to get missed out in all of this is, again, this massive component which I mentioned earlier on, which is ethics. This is the big area that gets missed out, because I think there's therapists in the audience, and I'm sure they probably are. The first thing the therapist doesn't generally tell tell their clients to do is actually clean up their ethical act. Whereas the Buddha is actually saying it's a strategy, which the meditation, the mindfulness, is one dimension of it. And the ethics is another extremely important dimension. And in fact, some early texts will say the meditation is of no use whatsoever if you don't actually look at the ethical basis in what you're doing, of what you're doing. So I don't think it's therapy in this narrow sense that we have in the West of looking at your past, seeing how things come about, kind of Freudian psychodynamic ways of looking at things. That isn't there in Buddhism at all. It's not there within the Buddhist idea of therapy. It's a therapy to deal with dissatisfaction across the board. And I think it's one possible translation of this term dukkha, is this total sense of dissatisfaction that human beings have in this world. Now, part of that dissatisfaction is not getting what you want. Also getting what you want. That's part of the dissatisfaction as well. And so it's looking at that many, many different ways. We really don't have time to go into it tonight, but I think the ethical component is the bit, I think, that makes Buddhism different from being a mere therapy in this Western sense.
Well, thank you very much. We've already gone over our time. I have to say many, many thanks to both John and Stephen. That's been absolutely fascinating. I also wanted to thank Giles, whose hospitality we have hugely appreciated over the last few months. And Stephen has brought programs from Gaia House, the meditation centre. Well, I'm not sure I'm allowed to use the word meditation anymore. the absolutely beautiful centre where both John and Stephen regularly teach. And I also wanted to make one last thanks to Mark Vernon, who's done an enormous amount about setting up these talks over the last 4 or 5 months, and he's been a great, great organiser and source of support. So many thanks to all of you for coming and being so patient with rather cramped, uncomfortable circumstances, but we didn't want to turn anyone away. So many thanks to everybody.
And thank you, Mary.